salmon croquettes from a can of pink fish and crushed crackers, potlikker drawn straight off a pot of greens, and purple hull peas cooked down in under 10 minutes. These women never wrote a recipe down. Here are 30 easy 10-minute meals for black seniors who miss old church days. What started as a can of pink salmon and a sleeve of saltine crackers ended up being the dish people talked about on the drive home from service. Salmon croquettes were church ladies' proof that nothing needed to be fancy to be magnificent, just seasoned right and cooked in a cast iron skillet. You drain the can, mix the fish with crushed crackers, a beaten egg, diced onion, and black pepper, shaped the patties by a feel, and laid them into hot oil. By the 1940s, canned salmon was a reliable pantry staple in black households across the South and North alike. The trick, and nobody told you this directly, was using your hands to judge when the mix was tight enough to hold in the pan. Too wet and they fell apart. Too dry and they tasted like cardboard. That judgment came from standing close enough to watch her do it. You either had it or you spent years getting it wrong. Pinto beans with smoked sausage were a staple in African American kitchens long before the words soul food existed. The key was in the seasoning. One piece of smoked link sliced thin, a diced onion softened in the pan first, and dried beans that had soaked overnight so they cooked fast. You never added salt until the end. Adding it too early kept the beans from softening, and anyone who grew up watching Sunday pots understood this without being told. The smoked sausage gave the whole pot a depth that no spice packet could replicate, and in the church kitchen, a pot of pinto beans over rice could stretch to feed 30 people without strain, making it the quiet workhorse of every repast table. The woman who made them at my grandmother's church never measured a thing. She cooked by smell, and when the pot smelled right, it was done. She passed in the winter of 1982. Nobody who came after her made them the same way, though everyone at that church tried for years afterward and never quite landed it. Nobody held the title of church egg maker by appointment. You earned it by producing deviled yolks that were smooth, not grainy, flavored with yellow mustard and sweet pickle relish, finished with paprika dusted on with a light hand. That paprika was not decoration. It was the signature, and anyone who used too much was noticed. Deviled eggs appeared at every church function from the 1930s forward, funerals, homecomings, baptism dinners, because they traveled well, needed no heat, and took under 10 minutes once the eggs were boiled. The unwritten law, you never took the platter home empty. 6 eggs, boiled 12 minutes, rinsed cold, and yet the woman who made the best ones was known by name across 3 counties because everyone understood the recipe was only half of it. The smell hit you before you crossed the doorway. Tomatoes and butter and rice absorbing everything into a softness that had no business tasting as good as it did. Stewed tomatoes and rice was a reflex more than a recipe, something made when the pantry was thin. You melted butter in a skillet, opened a can of whole tomatoes, broke them apart with a spoon, seasoned with salt and a pinch of sugar, then stirred and cooked rice until it became one thing. The sugar was the insider move, just enough to cut the acid, and you knew the right amount when the color deepened to brick red and the smell went from sharp to round. Through the 1940s and 50s, this dish appeared on church day tables where nothing was wasted and everything still tasted like someone had cared. Now it lives in the memory of every black senior who ate it after service at a grandmother's table in a kitchen that belongs to no one now who remembers how to make it. Before the stewed tomatoes made it to the table, something older was already being drawn off the greens. Potlikker, the dark, smoky broth left behind after a long cook, the liquid the older women always set aside before anything else was touched. Potlikker soup needed almost nothing. The broth itself, a pinch of red pepper flakes, and a scrap of fatback or smoked turkey neck that had been simmering in the original pot since morning. In communities across the rural South from the 1930s onward, potlikker was understood as medicine as much as food, rich in iron, folate, and potassium leached from the greens, and it was given to sick children and nursing mothers long before it was ladled out as supper for adults at the table. The unwritten rule was absolute. You never poured it down the drain. If you poured off the potlikker, you had missed the point of a pot of greens. Some elders drank it straight from a mug. Others crumbled cornbread in and ate it slow. Not a drop left that kitchen without purpose. You heard the pop before you saw it. The sound of fresh cut corn hitting hot butter in cast iron. That sharp hiss followed by sweetness rising off the skillet. Fried corn existed in the hands of the cook. You cut the kernels low off the cob, then scrape the back of the blade down the rows to collect the milk, that pale, starchy liquid, because without it, you had cooked corn. With it, you had something that went creamy at the center and caramelized at the edges. Cast iron was a requirement, not a preference. The sugars needed the even, dry heat that only a seasoned skillet could deliver. In the 1950s and 60s, late summer Sundays after church meant someone shucking ears on the back porch while the kitchen door stood open. That hiss of milk and hot butter was the sound of Sunday being exactly what it was supposed to be, and everyone in hearing distance knew it. Nobody called it a rice bowl back then. It was just supper, the kind pulled together on a Thursday when the big church pot was days gone and the week had not been kind. Vienna sausages came in a small can that cost almost nothing, and in black households from the 1950s through the 1980s, that can was always on the shelf. You sliced the sausages thin, browned them until the edges crisped, then laid them over white rice with a pour of the canned liquid to make a thin, salty sauce. Some people added hot sauce, some folded a slice of white bread over the bowl. The whole thing took 10 minutes and tasted like being taken care of, even when the person who used to take care of you was no longer there. That is what those small cans held, not just protein, but a particular comfort that no proper recipe could explain to someone who did not grow up reaching for one on a long, quiet evening. Canned salmon and onions on toast was the meal she made on days she was tired. Not tired the way young people are tired. Tired the way a woman gets after 50 years of feeding everyone else. She would open the tall can, drain it, pick out the larger bones, and fry the fish with sliced white onion until the onion went soft and the salmon crisped at the edges. Laid over buttered toast, it was not a fancy plate. It was a 10-minute meal she made for herself, alone at the small table by the window, where she ate quietly after the grandchildren had gone. Canned Alaskan salmon was an affordable household staple by the 1940s, available at every corner grocery and reliable in ways fresh fish often was not. After she was gone, her children found 3 cans in the cupboard above the stove. Nobody opened them for a long time. That is what a plain meal can carry, a whole person held in something as ordinary as a can on a kitchen shelf. Time equals 1 second / greater than in the weeks before the first frost, when fields were still giving. Crowder peas showed up in every black kitchen in the rural South in quantities that could feed the whole congregation. A variety of field pea named for the way seeds crowd each other in the pod. Crowder peas had been a Southern black farming staple since before the Civil War, and by the 1940s, they were as tied to late summer church suppers as anything else on the table. You cooked them with fatback, a piece of smoked pork that gave the pot a low, savory richness, and let them go until the pot liquor turned cloudy and the peas softened but held their shape. The fatback was not window dressing, it was the chemistry. Rendered fat coated the starch in each pea, making them silky instead of chalky. You could use the same peas on the same stove and miss the dish entirely by adding the fatback too late. What looked like a simple pot of field peas was in fact precision that nobody around that stove called precision because they had always known it without a word for it. She waited until the cracklins were still warm from rendering before working them into the cornmeal. That was the part that could not be faked or timed. Cracklin cornmeal griddle cakes were a post-church morning tradition in households where nothing from the hog went to waste. The crisped pork skin pieces left after lard rendering went into the batter before they went limp. Each cake went onto a dry cast iron griddle. The cracklins brought their own fat to the pan. They came up dense, golden, and slightly smoky. Nothing like a store pancake, nothing like plain cornbread, but something in between that belonged entirely to these kitchens. The women who made them knew the ratio by feel. Too many cracklins and the cakes crumbled. Too few and they tasted like nothing. The cakes told the truth. Butter beans were a church supper cornerstone in African American households from the 1930s through the 1960s. What the rest of the country called lima beans, cooked here with a ham hock until the pot liquor thickened and the beans softened into something close to a gravy. The ham hock was the architecture of the dish, giving the broth its body and releasing strands of smoky meat that dissolved into the pot without being asked. Nothing about the process was rushed. You did not hurry butter beans, and anyone who tried ended up with a bowl that tasted correct but felt wrong, thin where it should have been rich. The women who made it right knew the dish was done when it smelled finished, not when the clock said so. Before the stew, you had dried beans and a bone. After, you had something that held a whole afternoon inside it. She made it every third Sunday through the fall in the same dented pot she had carried north from Georgia in 1951. When she died, the pot stayed on the stove for 3 days before anyone moved it. Every church had one woman known for her chicken salad, and the debate over whose was best was never resolved, which was the point. She mixed shredded chicken with yellow mustard, sweet pickle relish, diced celery, and enough Duke's mayonnaise to bind it without going heavy, then laid it between slices of white bread before morning service. The secret was cooking the chicken the night before, so the meat tightened into clean, dry strands instead of wet shreds from a rushed bird. By the 1950s, cold chicken salad sandwiches were a church supper staple from Mississippi north to Chicago, made in large batches the evening before, needing no heat. At quarterly church dinners, the platter disappeared in the first 10 minutes. The woman who brought it stood just far enough away to appear modest while watching to see if people went back. They always did, and she knew they would. Skillet cabbage with smoked turkey was a weeknight workhorse that could feed 4 people for almost nothing and make the kitchen smell like something good was happening. You started with a head of green cabbage, chopped rough, and laid it into a skillet where a piece of smoked turkey neck or wing had already been browning in its own fat. The cabbage went in on top, the lid went on, and the whole thing steamed and wilted down until the cabbage had absorbed the smoky drippings and gone from sharp to tender and sweet. By the 1970s, smoked turkey had replaced ham hocks in many African American kitchens as a leaner substitute that still delivered the same depth, particularly in households where health concerns had begun to reshape the cooking. The transformation was the whole point, that a vegetable people sometimes pushed aside could become the thing everyone reached for first, once the right piece of smoked meat changed what it was capable of being. Snap bean and potato soup was the kind of dish that did not require a recipe so much as a memory. You broke the beans yourself, fresh from the garden in summer, dried or canned in the lean months, snapped each one at the joint the way you had been shown, and dropped them into a pot with quartered potatoes, a ham bone if you had it, or just salted water if you did not, and let everything go on low until the broth turned a soft, cloudy gold and the beans had given up their edges. There was a particular sound to this soup in the making, the pop of each snap bean, the knock of potatoes against the pot. And if you grew up in a kitchen where it was made, that sound meant something was coming that would fill you completely. Through the 1930s and 40s, snap beans and potatoes were among the most reliable crops in the gardens kept by black families across the rural South, grown because they stored well and could feed a household through lean weeks without fanfare. She made it through every fall. The pot has been quiet for years. Tomato gravy over a leftover biscuit was the Sunday morning move that nobody taught you because you were supposed to already know it. You made a roux, a spoonful of bacon fat worked into flour in a dry skillet until it turned the color of a brown paper bag, then poured in canned tomatoes and let the whole thing thicken into a gravy that was tangy and rich and dark at the edges. You laid it over a biscuit that had been split and left out overnight, one dry enough to drink up the gravy without going to mush. This was not a recipe for fresh biscuits. It was a recipe for the ones that were already there, the ones from yesterday's service, from the covered dish someone had left behind. The color told you when the roux was right. Too pale and it tasted raw. Too dark and it turned bitter. Nobody wrote that down. You learned it by watching the skillet and knowing the difference. Vienna sausages and potatoes in a skillet was a meal that belonged to the middle of the week, far from Sunday's abundance and close enough to Friday to feel the thinning. You sliced the potatoes thin and laid them into a hot cast iron skillet with oil. Let them go until they crisped at the edges and the kitchen filled with that particular starchy sweetness. Then added the sausages sliced on the diagonal and let everything come together in a pan that looked like it had been planned. It had not been planned. It had been assembled from what was on the shelf and what was in the bin, the way most good meals in these kitchens were assembled. In black households from the 1950s through the 80s, Vienna sausages were the shelf protein that never ran out because running out was not allowed. The can cost almost nothing. The meal it made cost even less. And on the nights when the week had been long and the body was tired, it tasted like exactly enough. Sardines and saltines with hot sauce were not a meal anyone photographed or put on a table for company. They were what you ate at the kitchen counter on a Tuesday when you were alone and the refrigerator had nothing else to offer. You opened the flat tin, laid the fish on the crackers whole, added a few drops of hot sauce from the bottle that lived permanently next to the stove, and ate them standing up without a plate. Canned sardines had been a staple in African American households since at least the 1930s, packed in oil or mustard sauce, rich in protein and cheap enough that keeping a tin on the shelf cost nothing. And they carried none of the social performance that other food did. There was no technique to master, no ratio to calibrate. The knowing was simpler than that. You needed the hot sauce, you needed the saltines to still have their snap, and you needed to be the kind of person who did not require an audience to eat well. Some of the best meals these kitchens ever made were the ones nobody else saw. The cast iron had to be right before the eggs went in, not smoking, not barely warm, but sitting at that particular dry heat where a drop of water skittered across the surface instead of sitting still. Nobody named that temperature. You learned it by putting your hand near the pan, close enough to feel the difference between warm and ready. The egg and onion scramble was the simplest thing these kitchens made, and the one that most reliably showed the gap between those who had learned and those who had not. Because the same eggs, the same onions, and the same skillet produced something tender in one cook's hands and rubbery in another's. You softened the onion in butter first, added the beaten eggs, and moved them slowly, pulling the curds from the edges until they were barely set. She made them Sunday mornings after she stopped going to church. She said the eggs were better at home. She was right. Nobody in the family ever asked why she had stopped going. Canned mackerel and onion hash was the kind of meal people ate without discussion and did not mention again. Not because it was anything less than good, but because it belonged to the category of food that sustained without ceremony. You opened the can, drained the brine, and broke the mackerel apart in a skillet with diced onion and a spoon of bacon fat, letting the whole thing cook until the onion softened and the fish crisped in places and the kitchen filled with the smell that was unmistakably itself. Atlantic mackerel in brine was an affordable, protein-rich pantry staple available in corner groceries across black neighborhoods from the 1940s onward, less glamorous than salmon, less familiar than tuna, but capable of producing a hash that was rich and deeply savory in under 10 minutes. Some ate it over rice, some ate it with crackers, some ate it from the pan because there was no one else at the table and the ritual of a proper plate had stopped meaning what it once did. If the mackerel hash was the solo Tuesday meal, hominy was the dish that pulled people back together, the one that showed up on church supper tables from the Carolinas to East Texas without needing explanation, because everyone in that room already knew what it was. Hominy and sausage began with corn that had been treated with lye or wood ash in nixtamalization, a process developed by indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica and carried into Southern cooking through centuries of agricultural exchange. Combined with sliced, smoked sausage, onion, and a pour of broth, it became a thick, chewy skillet meal that tasted like corn had always been trying to become something more. The nixtamalization transformed dried corn into something with a minerally sweetness and a tender chew that no untreated kernel could produce. By the 1950s, canned hominy was available in most Southern grocery stores, making the dish fast and reliable for any weeknight. You knew it was ready when the pan went almost dry and the smell became something ancient. Grits with butter was breakfast, lunch, or dinner, depending on what you served alongside. Proof that the simplest dishes often provided the deepest comfort. Stone ground or regular grits were cooked slowly with water or milk, stirred frequently to prevent lumps, until they reached a creamy consistency that held its shape on a spoon. A generous pat of butter stirred in at the end added richness that transformed humble corn into something almost luxurious. For seniors on fixed incomes, grits cost pennies per serving and satisfied hunger for hours. They could be dressed up with cheese, topped with eggs, or served alongside fish, sausage, or vegetables. The dish required patience but little active work, and the reward was a bowl full of warmth that connected you to generations of Southern tables where grits was simply a part of life. Liver and onions divided people into those who loved it and those who could not stand the thought, but seniors who appreciated it found one of the most nutritious and affordable meals available. Chicken or beef liver was soaked briefly in milk to mellow its flavor, then dredged in seasoned flour and pan-fried alongside heaps of sliced onions that caramelized into sweet, soft ribbons. The liver cooked quickly, staying tender inside while developing a savory crust. Rich in iron and B vitamins, liver provided nutrients that aging bodies often lacked. The cost was remarkably low. Liver remained one of the cheapest proteins at the butcher counter because so few people bought it anymore. For seniors willing to embrace this old-fashioned dish, liver and onions delivered both nutrition and nostalgia in generous portions. Tomato sandwiches with mayonnaise only appeared when the garden came in. That short window in July and August when the tomatoes were heavy, warm from the vine, and red all the way through. This was never a winter meal. The tomato had to be sliced thick, almost a quarter inch, laid on soft white bread, spread with Duke's mayonnaise, always Duke's in the South, where brand loyalty ran deeper than politics. Salt and black pepper on top, nothing else. The bread soaked through from the juice within seconds, and you ate it fast, leaning over the plate so it didn't drip down your wrist. For seniors who still kept a small garden or had a neighbor who brought tomatoes by, this sandwich was the taste of summer itself. No cooking, no heat from the stove, and a sweetness from the fruit that made the meal feel like a gift. Once the season passed, it was gone, and waiting for it to come back was part of what made it matter. A half pound of ground beef could become a full dinner if you knew what to do with the grease left behind. Purple hull peas with cornbread crumbled in was not a recipe so much as a ritual. The end of a summer Sunday after church, the pot still warm on the stove, the cornbread from morning with one wedge already gone. You crumbled what was left into a bowl, ladled the peas and their potlikker over the top, and let the cornbread soak until it swelled into the broth and became something between a soup and a memory. Purple hull peas, a field pea variety with a deep violet hull that fades to green in cooking, were a staple crop in Black family gardens across the Deep South and Gulf Coast for generations, and by the 1950s, they were as much a part of late summer as the heat. The potlikker was the whole point. The cornbread was the vehicle that let you eat every drop. She grew them in her garden until the summer she could not anymore. After that, the peas came from the store. They were fine, but they were not the same, and everyone at that table knew it and said nothing. Potted meat sandwiches from the church pantry were not anyone's first choice and were not meant to be. They were there for when the choice had already narrowed. You spread the meat onto white bread with mustard, pressed the slices together, and ate without performance. Potted meat, a heavily seasoned, shelf-stable blend popular in American working-class households from the 1950s onward, had been a fixture in African-American church pantries for decades, given out during hard times without comment. The women who ran those pantries knew which families would not ask, and they packed the bags accordingly, never making it a production. There was a grace in that knowing, in seeing what a family needed and providing it without requiring anyone to say the words out loud. She ran the pantry at our church for 22 years. She never kept records. She said that was between them and God. Cream corn from scratch in 10 minutes was one of those things that looked simple until you tried to do it right. You started the same way as fried corn, cutting the kernels low off the cob, then scraping the milk with the back of the blade. But from there, the two dishes parted ways entirely. The milk went into a skillet with butter and a little heavy cream. The kernels followed, and you stirred on medium heat until the starch in the corn milk thickened the liquid into a glossy, sweet sauce that coated every kernel. No flour, no cornstarch. The corn thickened itself, and knowing when to pull it off the heat was the part nobody could teach you directly. Before it left the stove, you had raw corn. 10 minutes later, you had something that would quiet a dinner table. She made it late in summer when the ears were heaviest and the milk ran thick. The last time anyone tasted it exactly right was the last summer she was well enough to stand at the stove. Plain white rice with pan drippings was the last lesson these kitchens ever taught, and it was the simplest one. Nothing is wasted, and nothing plain is ever really plain. You cook the rice, long grain, rinsed until the water ran clear, and twice its volume of water, lit it on low until every drop absorbed and the bottom of the pot went fragrant. Then you poured the drippings over the top, bacon fat, chicken drippings, or the dark foam from a pan of fried fish, and the rice went from a side dish to something complete. The practice of saving pan drippings was nearly universal in African American households from the Depression era through the 1970s, a direct inheritance of the West African culinary principle that every element of a meal had value. She kept a jar of drippings on the back of the stove her entire adult life. When the jar went out with her things, her youngest daughter held it a long time before she let it go. That jar was everything she knew about feeding people from almost nothing. Sealed up tight, irreplaceable.
Hot water cornbread patties were the fastest answer to empty stomachs, using only boiling water, cornmeal, and a pinch of salt to create golden cakes in minutes. The scalding water bloomed the cornmeal into a pliable dough that could be shaped by hand and dropped straight into hot fat. Each patty sizzled fiercely, the edges crisping almost immediately, while the center remained tender and warm. Children loved the hiss of batter meeting oil, a sound that promised food without delay. These small rounds cooked so quickly that a family could sit to eat before the firewood even burned low. Eaten plain or with a drizzle of cane syrup if fortune smiled, they were as close to instant bread as survival cooking could offer. In kitchens where time and ingredients were scarce, hot water cornbread patties proved that simplicity and speed could still bring satisfaction and a sense of care to a hard day's meal.
Graham cracker sandwiches were the secret weapon of busy mothers who needed something sweet in seconds flat. 2 graham cracker squares sandwiched a thick layer of frosting, peanut butter, or sweetened cream cheese, creating a handheld treat that satisfied without any cooking. Children came home from school to find these waiting on kitchen counters, the simple combination somehow tasting better than anything store-bought. Mothers kept graham crackers in the pantry specifically for these quick desserts, knowing they could assemble a batch while doing other tasks. The crackers provided just enough crunch against the creamy filling, and the whole thing could be eaten without plates or forks. Some mothers added chocolate drizzle or cinnamon to make them feel special.
Okra and tomato skillet toss captured the garden's gifts in one quick sweep of the spoon, perfect for warm evenings when the sun dropped low and appetites grew sharp. Fresh or canned tomatoes were chopped and tossed into hot oil with slices of tender okra, their flavors melding as steam rose from the pan. A pinch of salt, cracked pepper, and a splash of vinegar coaxed out a bright tang while the okra softened and released its subtle sweetness. In less than 10 minutes, the dish turned silky and rich, ready to spoon over rice or eat with nothing more than a hunk of bread. Families prized this meal for using whatever the garden offered, stretching a modest harvest into something filling and colorful. The sizzle of vegetables and iron and the sharp scent of tomato filled small kitchens with hope and homegrown pride, a reminder that even the simplest ingredients could make a supper worth remembering when time and supplies were running thin.
Vanilla wafer banana pudding cups were the dessert that appeared at church suppers, family reunions, and Sunday dinners without fail. Black mothers layered vanilla wafers with sliced bananas and instant vanilla pudding in small cups or glasses, creating individual servings that looked fancy but took almost no time. The pudding was mixed with cold milk and whisked until thick, then spooned over the wafers while children waited impatiently for their share. As the dessert sat, the wafers softened and absorbed the creamy pudding, creating a texture that melted on the tongue. Mothers made these in assembly line fashion, filling a dozen cups in minutes while dinner finished cooking. The combination of sweet vanilla, fresh banana, and tender cookie satisfied every craving without heating up the kitchen.
Molasses cornbread skillet came together in a rush of sweet aroma and sizzling iron, a lifesaver when time and money were short. The batter started with simple cornmeal and a spoonful of baking powder stirred into warm milk. Then dark molasses flowed in to lend a deep, earthy sweetness that turned every bite into comfort. A heavy cast iron pan was heated until nearly smoking, greased with whatever fat was on hand, and the batter poured in with a hiss that filled the room with the promise of quick nourishment. 10 minutes later, the edges pulled from the pan, the center set firm, and the top turned golden brown while the bottom formed a crust that crackled beneath a knife. Families sliced it thick, eating it plain when sugar was scarce or drizzling a little syrup if luck allowed. This skillet bread needed no fancy ingredients or long waiting, only a hot fire and steady hand, making it the kind of meal that fed weary workers before dawn or after a long day in the fields.
Instant chocolate pudding revolutionized weeknight desserts in Black households during the 1960s, transforming 3 minutes of whisking into creamy satisfaction. Mothers poured the powder into cold milk, beat it with a hand mixer or whisk until thick, then spooned it into cups for eager children who could barely wait for it to set. The pudding could be eaten immediately while still soft or chilled until firm, depending on how patient the family felt. Some mothers topped it with Cool Whip, vanilla wafers, or crushed peanuts for texture. The convenience was revolutionary, allowing working mothers to provide homemade tasting dessert without spending precious evening hours in the kitchen. Children grew up believing their mothers made the best pudding, never realizing the magic came from a small box.
Sugar top hoe cakes were a blessing when the cupboard looked bare and stomachs were already rumbling. Cornmeal was mixed with a splash of water, a pinch of salt, and just enough sweet sugar to lift the flavor, then scooped by hand onto a smoking skillet slicked with bacon grease. The cakes sizzled and popped as they browned within minutes, the edges crisping while the center stayed soft and warm. Children often hovered close, eager to snatch the first cake off the griddle while the sugar still glistened on top like a thin, glassy crust. For many families, these hoe cakes doubled as breakfast and supper, eaten straight from the pan or layered with scraps of fried meat if any was left from the night before. They proved that a handful of cornmeal and a bit of patience could stretch into a meal that filled bellies and hearts alike, a quick victory against the gnawing hunger that lingered through lean times.
Jello with fruit cocktail was the jewel-toned dessert that sparkled on tables across Black households throughout the 1960s. Mothers dissolved bright red, orange, or green gelatin powder in hot water, stirred in cold, then folded in canned fruit cocktail before chilling. The result was a wobbly, sweet treat that children found endlessly fascinating, watching the suspended fruit pieces float in the colorful gel. It required no cooking beyond boiling water and could be made the night before, freeing mothers for other tasks. The dessert appeared at potlucks in decorative molds, at home in simple bowls, and always drew smiles from children who loved its bouncy texture. Fruit cocktail stretched the dessert further, making one box of Jello feed the whole family with fruit in every spoonful.
Field pea stir-fry turned leftover peas into a 10-minute marvel, saving both time and precious ingredients. Pre-cooked field peas were tossed into a hot skillet with diced onions and small cubes of smoked salt pork, the fat sizzling as it released a savory aroma. A quick splash of vinegar or a grind of black pepper added brightness, while the peas heated through, soaking up the smoky flavor. The dish went from cold to steaming in less time than it took to set the table, offering a hearty side or even a full meal with a piece of bread. For families working long days in the fields, this recipe fit perfectly between dawn chores and midday labor. delivering protein and comfort without delay. The simple combination of earthy peas and salty pork made each bite deeply satisfying, proof that even the humblest leftovers could be reborn into something new and memorable with only a hot pan and a few quick turns of the spoon.
Sugarbread was perhaps the simplest dessert in any Black mother's repertoire, requiring nothing more than bread, butter, and white sugar. Soft white bread was spread with butter and sprinkled generously with sugar, then folded in half or eaten open-faced as an afternoon treat. Children requested it constantly, the combination of soft bread, rich butter, and sweet crunch satisfying something deep in their souls. Mothers made it when the pantry held little else, when children needed something sweet before dinner, or when there was simply no time for anything more elaborate. The dessert cost almost nothing and could be assembled in under a minute, making it the ultimate solution for busy households. Some mothers toasted the bread first for extra crunch, while others added a dash of cinnamon to make it feel fancy.
Peanut stew with rice was a bold, nourishing dish born from West African traditions and adapted to the speed of a 10-minute meal. Leftover rice from yesterday's supper warmed quickly, while a handful of peanuts was ground into a paste and thinned with hot water to create a creamy sauce. Onions and garlic sautéed in a little fat gave the stew a savory backbone as the peanut mixture bubbled into a fragrant gravy. If there was a scrap of smoked meat or a pinch of chili pepper, it found its way into the pot. But even without extras, the flavor was deep and rich. When poured over hot rice, the stew coated every grain, providing protein and comfort in each bite. Families cherish this recipe for its speed and its tie to ancestral flavors, a taste of heritage that fit neatly into a hurried morning or a weary evening. In the toughest days, it proved that tradition and survival could share the same bowl.
Peanut butter balls were rolled by hand at kitchen tables where children helped shape the sticky mixture into bite-sized treats. Mothers mixed peanut butter with powdered sugar and a little butter until the dough held together, then let small hands roll it into balls that went straight into waiting mouths. The recipe required no cooking, no baking, and no special equipment beyond a mixing bowl and willing fingers. Some versions were rolled in crushed graham crackers, coconut, or cocoa powder for variety, each family developing their own signature style. The balls could be made ahead and stored in the refrigerator, providing grab-and-go sweetness throughout the week. Children learned to make these themselves, their first cooking lesson being something sweet and nearly impossible to mess up.
Mustard green sauté brought bright flavor and vital nutrients to the table with almost no effort. Freshly washed greens were cut into ribbons and tossed into a skillet slicked with a spoonful of hot oil and a clove of crushed garlic. The leaves wilted in moments, turning a deep emerald as a splash of vinegar or squeeze of lemon sharpened their natural bite. A pinch of salt and a dusting of pepper finished the dish, creating a vibrant side that tasted far richer than its brief cooking time suggested. In less than 10 minutes, the greens softened into a tender, tangy pile that could top cornbread, rice, or simply stand alone. Families valued this quick method for preserving the garden's bounty and adding something fresh to otherwise heavy meals. Mustard green sauté proved that speed and simplicity could still deliver a dish that nourished body and spirit, turning a handful of backyard leaves into a feast of color and flavor on even the leanest days.
Cinnamon sugar toast was the dessert that doubled as breakfast, snack, and midnight treat in Black households throughout the 1960s. Bread was toasted until golden, spread thick with butter while still hot, then showered with cinnamon sugar that melted into fragrant sweetness. The butter had to be applied immediately, so it would soak into the warm bread and help the sugar mixture stick properly. Children stood by toasters waiting for their slices, the smell of cinnamon filling kitchens and signaling comfort. Mothers kept a jar of pre-mixed cinnamon sugar on the counter specifically for this purpose, the simple preparation requiring no thought or measurement. The toast could be cut into triangles for smaller children or served whole for those with bigger appetites, always delivering the same warm satisfaction.
Redeye ham gravy over grits provided a powerful start to the morning with almost no weight at all. Thin slices of ham were quickly fried until their edges crisped and their fat rendered into the pan. Then a strong pour of black coffee was added to create the signature Redeye gravy. The hot liquid hissed as it loosened the savory bits from the skillet, blending into a smoky, salty brew that smelled like dawn itself. Meanwhile, yesterday's leftover grits were reheated with a splash of water until creamy once again, ready to cradle the bold sauce. In less than 10 minutes, the meal was ready, the deep flavor of ham and coffee soaking into every spoonful. Workers heading into long days treasured this combination for its hearty comfort and jolt of caffeine, a breakfast that woke the senses and filled the stomach in equal measure. Redeye ham gravy over grits turned simple scraps into something that tasted like luxury.
These kitchens went quiet. No cookbook captured what lived in them. Leave her name in the comments. She deserves to be remembered.